So I wanted to do a quick video today talking about FreeSync and hopefully helping dispel any myths about how it works, and maybe people can get a better understanding. So when they're trying to use FreeSync with their games, that they're like wondering, why isn't this working? And instead just enjoy the experience. Real quick, I want to cover, their obvious stuff is make sure that when you have your display, make sure that AMD FreeSync is enabled. This is an obvious thing, but yeah, you want to do that. You also notice that as I moused over this here, it says from 48 to 75 hertz. That's a key thing to remember because 48 is the low end. If you go below 48, FreeSync is essentially not enabled, and you're going to have potentially what looks like some minor stuttering because the frames are trying to synchronize at a lower frame rate, right? So that's what you're going to see. You're not going to get tearing, or at least you shouldn't get any tearing, but you will see some kind of frame stuttering. I guess you could get tearing, but for the most part, as I've seen, it's just been more of a stutter. Before we go off on the important bits, I want to cover the fact that, so for me, I have two GPUs. I have two Fury X cards, and because it's in Crossfire, there's more issues that you're going to run into. That's just the bottom line. If you're doing Crossfire, you're going to find that Crossfire will be a problem for some games and will be a benefit for others. And so certain games, you're going to want to completely disable Crossfire. Now, for the most part, I have had a really great experience in the long run with Radeon settings. It's been really good, and I don't really need to do any major tweaks. I do have some global settings tweaks. Like I do have the shader cache enabled because I believe that is a benefit. I go ahead and leave the surface format optimization on. The thing to remember here is, and we'll get into this, is pretty much disable frame rate targeting control and never use it. That's just my opinion. But we're going to talk about why in a minute. With Crossfire, most of these settings where you see it's enabled, in fact, here, where's another one? So let's talk about like Chivalry, for example. I have Crossfire disabled on Chivalry because it just wasn't helping. It's impressive that a lot of games, what's actually happening is that it's essentially using both GPUs, but it's kind of motoring them back and forth to kind of keep essentially with the one that's got the best temperatures. Well, at least that's what I've observed. And I think that's impressive, but I do think that it isn't helping in a sense of in total. So a lot of these games, I'll specify within the profile to disable Crossfire. The thing is that I encountered with Titanfall 2, for example, is that when I had Crossfire enabled, I was basically getting a huge amount of artifacting, tearing, and there's reasons for that. My solution originally was just to turn off Crossfire, then the game would run really well, and then I would have to essentially just because I only have one GPU. What has happened more recently is because I have a larger monitor and because the resolution is really high, what I end up doing is just kind of turning off the anti-aliasing, and then Crossfire works pretty well at this point. And I think because of some profile updates, it's actually working much better. And I'm not seeing the tearing issues that I encountered before. So, and this is one of the most important things to understand with Crossfire. Almost guaranteed, you will have to have VSync on of some sort if you're going to do a Crossfire. And that's a downside for some people, because without it, basically, you can't avoid tearing. And the VSync is actually helping Crossfire to synchronize the timing. And that's one of the most important things with a lot of these games, is that without VSync, you're just going to get tearing, all over the place. Even when you're below the limit, you're going to get tearing because the Crossfire frames are happening off time and then overwriting it. So that's the thing to remember about Crossfire, is there's some trade-offs. The trade-off is, yes, you're probably going to get higher frames if you can get it to work, and that's great. But you hopefully will just be using VSync to mitigate any of the synchronization issues that come along with that. Now, I will talk a little bit about The Witcher real quick. That's one I had a lot of trouble with. And I have a 75 hertz monitor. And when I was setting everything to max, The Witcher would tear and stutter horribly. Now, the reason for that is the game itself. Now, I'm guessing there's going to be plenty of people that go, well, I've got an NVIDIA and it works great. And that's fine. I have an NVIDIA GPU as well on another machine. And with a single GPU, you probably won't have any issues at all. The problem is when you get into higher resolutions like where I'm at, which is I'm now on a 3860 by 1600 monitor, you can't get 60 frames per second with one GPU. Like you can't even really get a steady 60 frames per second with one GPU on The Witcher at lower resolutions for the most part. So at least on a like for example 3440 by 1440. That is why I bought a second GPU, is because I wanted to have The Witcher at least 60 frames per second. I'm very glad to say that it's very good today, but keep in mind there is an interesting caveat, and that The Witcher is tuned, at least for the respective Crossfire, is tuned to be at 60 FPS. Any higher than 60 FPS, and The Witcher will start to tear or stutter, and that's a sad fact. So what I've done is I've actually set specifically for The Witcher that it has to be at 60 FPS. The beauty of that is both GPUs are being used and are with ultra settings all over the place. They're being used to the fullest, and I'm getting a really, really, really stable experience. And so that's the most important, is fluid frames, stability for me at a higher resolution. It's really great. If you had, say, for example, a 1080 Ti or whatever's coming out, you probably only need one GPU, and you could probably drive Witcher 3 really, really well at a higher resolution, which is awesome. And you don't really need to worry about that kind of stuff. So, but for me, for my money and what I spent on, this is what's working for me. And that's one of the caveats is, again, using Crossfire. I get FreeSync to work, but you need to really consider, you have to be having, like, frame limiting is key here to get this to work exactly the way you expect. Now, one more thing I've done, actually. This was actually what made it really work, which is very sad. I actually have to downclock the monitor when I play The Witcher 3 because of this weird 60 hertz problem. And, sure, it'll run just fine at 75 hertz. And with FreeSync, it does work. It's just not as smooth. And trust me, I've spent many hours testing it because it's my favorite game. So I wanted to make sure that it was working right. So moving on from the Crossfire issues and focusing on FreeSync and how to get it working right. Again, we talked about enabling it and making sure it's on. Now, here's the thing that everybody has to understand about FreeSync. What does it really do, and why is it even, what makes it worth it? Well, let's say, for example, if you had the beefiest of GPUs ever in life, and basically if you had a perfect GPU, FreeSync would be useless, because you would if you had a GPU that could drive any game at any rate, then that would mean it could equal or exceed your monitor's refresh, which is not what FreeSync is for. FreeSync is for when those small moments where the frames dip below your monitor's refresh, your maximum. So if you have a perfect GPU and you're, like, for example, like if you have a 75 hertz monitor, but all your games can run at 100 plus FPS, then FreeSync is essentially useless to you. And you could get an older, cheaper monitor or whatever that isn't FreeSync, but has a high refresh. And, as long as you used VSync, if that's what you like to do, it would essentially FreeSync is essentially useless. In my experience, I think FreeSync is great. For those moments where it does dip, you really don't notice. Right. And that's the key. And it only might dip a little bit. It might even dip down to the low end. I'll use The Witcher 3 again as an example when it comes to the experience in FreeSync. It makes The Witcher 3 much better, in my opinion. So when I didn't have a FreeSync monitor, that stuttering that you would experience in non-FreeSync would be there. It would just feel stuttery. It would transition from being smooth to stuttery. And that sucked. Okay. But when I'm using FreeSync, it would transition. You just don't notice. It's just kind of like you might feel a bit more choppy, but only on a slight amount. And so you really don't notice. So that's the value, is going all the way down to 48 hertz from 75 in this case. You're going to have the experience that is, as best as it can be. But if you're not going below, or if you're able to tune your game to never go below your monitor's refresh, it makes no sense to even be concerned about FreeSync. Now, if you want to make sure that it's working, one of the best ways to do that, for example, is, in my case, the Acer monitors have an FPS meter that is directly in the monitor. So you can see what the actual frames are. Now, I really played a lot with this when I was playing Doom. I was really trying to make sure I was getting that FreeSync was working. And that was one of the ways that I tested it, was I would put the FPS on the monitor on to see where the range actually was. And you'll notice, like obviously if it's enabled, you'll see it fluctuate in a range. And if it's disabled, it'll stay steady regardless of what the actual FPS is of your game. That's how you can tell if it's working. Now, you'll also kind of be able to tell it's working just by that smoothness. If it drops below 60 or 75 or whatever that yours is at, you'll kind of feel like, oh, wow, okay. Either one, you'll notice, what does this feel like? Or you won't, right? Now, let's move on to the idea behind what to do about FreeSync and how to get it to work. Now, there's two choices here that people, I think, don't really realize. You really have two ways of approaching the problem. You can have VSync on, and with VSync on, you're pretty much, in fact, for most games, you don't need to do any frame limiting at all. You can just turn VSync on and you're done, right? And that should work with FreeSync perfectly well. What'll happen is that it will buffer all the way up to the max at 75 hertz or whatever that you're at. And then as it starts to dip, it will properly feed the frames in at the right rate. And that the VSync is important if you want to guarantee that you're not tearing above a certain amount. There is pretty much guaranteed going to be a small amount of latency when you have VSync enabled, and that's true for when you have VSync. Pretty much proven time and time again, and this goes for G-Sync as well, that when you have VSync, if you turn VSync off, but you're able to keep your frames below the maximum, you know, again, there's a certain range here, but if you can keep it from actually reaching or exceeding the maximum frame rate, you will have the best latency for the best frame rate you can get. The problem is in actual practice. So let's say, for example, we'll go pick a game. Let's say Killing Floor, for example. In practice, you actually need to set the actual frames to something lower. Like if my maximum is 75, I may need to set it to 70 FPS, probably at best 72, or maybe rarely, depending on how well the game is optimized, 73. But that's the range where FreeSync is going to not exceed the maximum FPS. Now, again, I don't want to be using FRTC. I want to be using RTSS because RTS is better. Now, for a global setting, I just go ahead and set it to what my refresh is, just so there's no game that is stupidly using frames unnecessarily, right? And that helps me for the most part. For games, like I said, for The Witcher, I went ahead and set it to 60. I also set the monitor's refresh to 60 as well. Titanfall, I have in here, I think, as a specific setting, but I actually don't think it's any different. And I think I was tuning Titanfall for a while, and it was one of those examples. So I'm going to go ahead and remove it now. It was an example of turning down the refresh to something like 2, or the frame rate to something like 72, and then turning off VSync and trying that. Now, in my experience, here's the end-all thing with this. Obviously, if you're a competitive person, you're going to want the least amount of latency, right? And that's important. But your trade-off is that you just lost anywhere between 2, maybe 3, to even 5, or sometimes even 10 FPS off of whatever you're playing. And that it doesn't make sense, right? It's like, why would I throw away frames or FPS for latency? And there's reasons. You can make the argument that 70 FPS with the minimum latency is better than 75 FPS with some latency. But that just depends on who you are. If you're more competitive or if you're more experiential gamer, you need to make that choice. It really is just simple enough. It's very simple and works completely well. If you just want to turn down your frame rate limit to some lower percent, you'll notice that for the most part, if you're using Radeon settings and you go to turn on frame rate target control, it will set the default to something below, like a good percent below your actual monitor's refresh. Keep that in mind, that you can't just put it at the refresh with VSync off, because what happens is there's certain timings that are going to occur that is just not going to sync up. But I have seen cases where I've turned down the frame rate just a little bit, and got that effect. People might be saying, well, why am I using Rivet Tuner versus frame rate target control? Well, I've done a lot of videos and commentary about this. The bottom line is Rivet Tuner just works better. It's just better for everything. And in some ways it's almost magic. Now you can go look all the stuff up, but Rivet Tuner does a really, really good job of essentially working on frame timing. And so the frame timing is really what is creating this additional smoothness. And I had one of these questions where people ask, well, are you using the in-game limiter versus, Rivet Tuner? And I've seen enough commentary by others to say that I would trust using Rivet Tuner over in-game limiters, because Rivet Tuner is going to do a very good job of pacing these frames versus the in-game limiter. You don't know what the developer decided to do. They don't know if that's using up GPU or CPU processes in order to time more properly, just specifically for the game. So if you offload that to Rivet Tuner, then I'm seeing that seems to be better. And in my experience, I've played around with this before, and I really do feel like Rivet Tuner does the job. I think at this point, I'm gone a little bit long on this video. I would, if anybody wants to ask questions, I'm really open to it. I'm doing this video based upon the questions that I've got. And I wanted to kind of like do a quick thing about it and hopefully cover the fact that really I've had trouble with FreeSync and getting it to work, but it's really not that crazy. And if it's not working for you, there's probably some caveat of why not. I mean, in the worst case, you could have defective hardware. And so I hope that helps people with their gaming experience. I do think FreeSync is worth it. I think it's great technology. But again, like I said, it's useless for people who have a really, really high frame rate potential. If you're going to spend extra money for some reason, even with G-Sync, to get a monitor that can go below and have like a FreeSync range or a G-Sync range, it just doesn't make any sense. Like if you were getting a 1080p monitor that had FreeSync, and let's say it only went to 60 FPS and your GPU can drive it at 100 plus, it doesn't make sense to concern yourself with that. But if you did have a 144 hertz monitor, and it has a FreeSync range and you were competitive, then that's awesome. You should do that. So that's it. Please give this video a like if it helped you, and subscribe for more content like this. Thanks.